Next up, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Lynne Parker. Dr. Lynne Parker is Associate Vice Chancellor at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and Director of the AI Tennessee Initiative, which aims to position the university and the state of Tennessee as a national and global leader in the data-intensive knowledge economy. Previously, she served as the founding director of the National Artificial Intelligence Initiative Office in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and as Deputy Chief Technology Officer of the United States. Dr. Parker has held numerous other leadership positions, including at UTK, Interim Dean of the Tickle College of Engineering, the National Science Foundation, Division Director for Information and Intelligence Systems, and Oak Ridge National Laboratory, Distinguished R&D Staff Member and Group Leader. She is a Fellow of AAAI, AAAS, and IEEE, and is also a distinguished member of ACM. She received her PhD in Computer Science from MIT. Dr. Parker is joined by Michael Kratsios, Managing Director at Scale. Michael, over to you.
Lynne, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us at TransformX.
Thanks, Michael. It's great to be here.
Well, it's terrific to have you. And as many folks who are joining us today know that, since 2015, you really have worked extensively in helping advance AI initiatives and policy across the entire federal government. You began at the National Science Foundation and have done a tremendous amount of work also all the way to the White House. And with your leadership, the nation really has made a ton of progress in improving AI coordination kind of across the board. And most importantly, you've done it across 3 different presidential administrations. You recently have returned to the University of Tennessee, Knoxville as the Associate Vice Chancellor and Director for the AI Tennessee Initiative. So I think to kind of kick things off, I would love to hear a little bit about what the AI Tennessee Initiative is and really how your time in government service has helped kind of inform the work that you're doing today.
Sure, happy to address that, Michael. So the AI Tennessee Initiative is both a research and an education initiative to position the University of Tennessee and the state of Tennessee as a leader in this data-driven, knowledge-driven economy that we have now. Our initiative is both a research initiative as well as an education initiative. So on the research front, we want to not only advance the fundamental abilities of AI in terms of novel advances in algorithms and data science and so forth, but we also want to look at those verticals, the coupling of AI with particular other disciplines, and it could be any discipline. And what we want to do in the AI Tennessee Initiative is to focus on those areas where Tennessee already has some strengths, areas like advanced manufacturing, as an example, where we can combine AI with those strengths and really make a unique name for ourselves in terms of a leader, being a leader in this space. And so we want to do this by looking at a transdisciplinary approach as well. So we're trying to form partnerships across the state of Tennessee and with others as well in order to bring people from lots of different disciplines together so that we can emphasize those unique capabilities that Tennessee can bring to our AI capabilities of the nation. And I think this is something that's particularly of interest to me after having served in government for actually, 6 years now over the last 7.5. It's interesting to me because it became very clear in my role in the White House, for instance, that it's not just about setting those policies, but it's also about implementing the policies. And talent and the development of talent and capabilities across the entirety of the United States is so important. And so this is an opportunity, I think, for me to come back home. Tennessee is my home, and to develop these capabilities so that people all across the state of Tennessee can engage in this new era of AI opportunity.
No, that's really incredible to see. And I think as we used to talk about years ago together, the importance of bringing together both sort of academia, private sector, and the federal government together to drive these efforts. Because if each of those pieces of the innovation ecosystem are trying to fight the battle alone, they're never going to be able to achieve the type of breakthroughs that you can if you can kind of pull together. So I'm excited to see kind of how kind of that unfolds. One thing that I kind of wanted to talk to you a little bit about and hear your perspective is is generally this question of kind of how your sort of personal journey in the road of policy has developed. I mean, you have really been have a front row seat in how the United States as a country and even globally, there has been this progression really from 0 to 1 on AI policy. You can sort of think back all the way to the Obama years when kind of the first reports were being written about artificial intelligence, and then over time we have progressed now to a point where, you know, it's something that presidents are talking about in speeches, and there is legislation being passed and entire sort of organizations being built in the White House. So I would love to kind of hear your perspective on kind of how that journey has unfolded. You know, what has taken place in the U.S. from those very early days in the mid 2010s to where we are now.
Yeah, you know, it's hard to imagine. It's only been 6 years, really, since I first began working in the AI policy space. That was back in 2016 when I started work on the National AI R&D Strategic Plan. And I think if you look at the kind of the road of development of policies over these last 6 years, it's sort of transformed from thinking about what needs to be done and, you know, actions that we should take to more and more of the implementation of those ideas and policies, and recognizing that, you know, we can all agree on fundamental principles or fundamental areas of action that need to be taken. But then, you know, kind of the rubber hits the road. At some point, you have to actually do these things and implement these policies. So early on, if you think back to, you know, the 2016, at the end of the Obama administration, there were 3 reports that came out. That's, you know, one of them was about the landscape of AI and the opportunities there, be it R&D or maybe it's about governance or education and workforce implications and so forth. And that's kind of a thought piece, really. This is the opportunity of AI, the promise of AI, and the challenges that we need to be able to address. And then, but then it comes along to let's actually do it. And so I think that's what was really important in 2019 when the executive order under the Trump administration for maintaining American leadership in AI came out, certainly under your leadership as well. And that defined concrete actions that the federal government needs to take in research and development, and the infrastructure like data for research and development, as well as governance on how we might think about regulation of AI in the private sector, as well as international engagement and other kinds of areas that need attention. And so since that time, then the federal government has been working on actually implementing those things. And I'm very pleased that the federal agencies did deliver on all the things that were laid out in that first executive order. And then that followed on, of course, with a closer look as to how the federal government itself should use AI. And so then in late 2020 was the second Trump administration executive order on promoting the use of trustworthy AI in the federal government. And that came out of, you know, we had the AI in Government Summit prior to that really brought together people from across the federal agencies to think about how do we accelerate the use of AI in government and how do we do that responsibly. And so I think since that time, there's been more and more of a focus on creating the approaches that the federal government can use to leverage AI, as well as building on the research capabilities, such as the launching of the National AI Research Institutes back in 2019, that help build up the research capability. Now with the congressional launching of the National AI Initiative, the National AI Initiative established the National AI Initiative Office, as well as the National AI Resource Task Force, which is building out infrastructure concepts for how we can build a computational and data infrastructure for AI R&D. So all of these actions, I think, early on, it was about principles such as the OECD principles on how we should use AI that were agreed to globally, as well as the concrete actions that we need to take. And then more recently, it's about actually delivering on those.
No, it's been really a tremendous journey, and I think if you asked sort of people in Washington kind of what are priorities in the world of technology, you know, 5 years ago, or even 6 years ago and to where we are today, you've obviously seen sort of artificial intelligence move up very quickly in areas where the U.S. needs to continue to be a leader on and sort of maintain that leadership and what efforts kind of need to be taken. I think in your roles, you've had this unique experience of kind of doing sort of essentially like touching all facets of, or all levers of available to policymakers. So as someone in the executive branch, you're sort of able to execute on executive orders and drive sort of initiatives there. But I think what you quickly realize is that you have to have Congress come along on board to actually appropriate the dollars to make this stuff work, and to put stuff into law so it lasts in perpetuity. So I don't know if you want to just talk a little bit about how do you sort of view sort of the uptake speed or the progress that even Congress or other places in Washington that you've seen have sort of come to realize the importance of this and built the necessary skills they need to actually be able to legislate on and then execute, because it's not just an executive branch action. It has to be something that you do kind of across the legislative branch as well.
It's so true. And I think, codifying these ideas through legislation is a way to make these initiatives have more impact over time. And it's great, I think, that the National AI Initiative Act was bipartisan and bicameral. I think this is one area that I think there's general agreement on across whatever part of the political spectrum somebody lies on. I think there is a recognition that these are important for the nation. These actions are important for the nation. And, Congress does play an important role in codifying some of these actions and initiatives. It's true that many of these kinds of actions that are laid out, some of them were already, sort of some early implementations of these actions had already taken place in the executive branch. But as a national strategy, we want that to survive from one administration to the next. And that's not easy to do without having it codified. And so Congress has certainly picked up on all of these areas of importance. And certainly the AI caucus has been an important leader group that leads on congressional action. And they've been very proactive, I think, in trying to understand what are those topics that we as a nation need to focus on, whether it's maybe OMB writing governance or guidance for how the agencies should think about the use of AI, or whether it's about OPM developing an occupational series for AI, or it's about making sure that GSA has an AI Center of Excellence so that agencies can work together to help implement areas of AI that are important for the agencies and may be useful from one agency to another to leverage the learnings from one to another. So all of these kinds of actions, I think, help us as a nation have more consistency over the years as administrations change to keep the focus on what's good for the nation. Rather than one administration focusing on one thing or another. And so I think it's been a great all-of-nation effort. And you mentioned earlier the importance of that ecosystem, industry and academia and government all working together. And it's true within government itself. All the agencies, the executive branch, as well as Congress working together towards some common goals, all for making sure that the nation is economically competitive, that the quality of life of all Americans is enhanced, and that we maintain our national security. So it's all of us working together that's, I think, so encouraging.
Absolutely, yeah, couldn't agree more. And I think, kind of speaking a little about Congress, it's something that I have definitely seen is that Congress and very large extent, kind of the administration as well, has really been interested in this notion of sort of diversifying the physical locations where innovation is happening across the country. And there's a growing number of programs which sort of think about this particular issue, from folks at Congressional AI Caucus, which you mentioned, the AI Across America initiative. You're seeing it with the new National Science Foundation's innovation engines, where they're working very hard to try to find ways to sort of create ecosystems that can drive sort of transformation or technological breakthroughs. So I guess a question to you is, like, how do you sort of think about why geographical diversity is so important for innovation, or what's the interplay between geographical diversity and actual sort of innovation output? And then if you go kind of one layer deeper, it's like to what extent does that translate to the average citizen? Because a lot of times when people talk about sort of innovation, they talk about like breakthroughs or like something you make in a lab, but how does that actually translate to an everyday American that is, just trying to live their life and succeed? And so I think I'm curious kind of how you think about that geographical diversity role within the innovation ecosystem.
Yeah, the United States is a large country, and we are not all the same. There are so many differences from one region to another, and the areas of opportunity, the challenges are different from one region to another. My area, for instance, has some of the poorest counties in the whole country in Appalachia. And so there are implications of that are unique to the region of Appalachia. Healthcare, for instance, and the kinds of challenges that people experience because of poverty is something that's not going to be an issue everywhere in the country. Some regions of the country, of course, are deep into agriculture. And so there are opportunities for AI there that rural areas, in these rural areas that the urban areas would not have. And so I think when you look at all the amazing geographic diversity that we have across this country, it's not just about the geography itself. It's about the people and the challenges, the opportunities are different. And so as a nation, I think we want to have actions that benefit all Americans. And we want to build up those opportunities that may be unique in some cases to certain regions of the country. If you think about education opportunities, for instance, we want to make sure that students that have an interest in AI don't have to move in order to engage in jobs that use AI. So we want to provide opportunities in industries throughout the country that can be available to people from across the nation. So I think geographic diversity plays a role in so many different axes of consideration, whether it be the kinds of applications or the kinds of uses of AI that are relevant, all the way to the education and training opportunities that are available to students and workers. So I think as a nation, we're stronger when all parts of the nation are strong. And so that's one of the things that really drove me in particular to coming back to Tennessee is I think, we're an interior state. We're not on the coast. We're not alone. There are other states as well that can also learn to build up their AI capabilities. And so that's one of the things that I'm excited about doing through the AI Tennessee initiative as well.
Yeah, and one thing I think a lot about too is AI as a discipline in isolation. There's a lot you can do as sort of a researcher, but having proximity and sort of the inclusion of domain experts into that research project can add tremendous benefits. So you may be working on a sort of a large language model, or you may be doing something relating to robotics, but if you don't have the person who is actually like running the massive warehouse or the massive sort of manufacturing facility side by side with you, you're not going to be able to actually take that technology and make it into something that is usable to domain experts. So how do you actually, to the end users, how do you kind of think about sort of domain expertise being tied to some of these research endeavors, all kind of looped into this geographic diversity question?
Yeah, I mean, it's very much about the partnerships and making sure that we're bringing in these multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary teams. When you look at the success of AI, and, a lot of people try to measure what is the impact of AI on industry, on the economy, and so forth. When you start digging into it, there are a number of cases where people say, well, AI did not have the kind of impact that we wanted to have in that particular application. And you start digging into it. And it's exactly this point, Michael, that you bring up is the fact that you didn't have all the right people at the table. You didn't have all the domain experts there who know the application space. And so that means that you have maybe the AI developers, they think they understand the problem, but they actually don't. And so at the end of the day, you developed a solution that's for a different problem and not the one that is at hand. And so I think, again, getting back to that point that different parts of the country are different, there are different kinds of challenges and issues, which means that the domain experts in those areas are all across the country. And really, when we try to address a challenge with an AI solution, we need to bring together not only the people who know the AI, but we also need to bring together the people who know the use case, maybe some industry folks, those on the user side, maybe even government, depending upon what the opportunity is. Maybe state and local governments can provide some educational opportunities or some opportunities for community colleges to join in and provide some expertise and help build up the talent through those use cases that now helps form sort of the next generation of talent in all of these areas. And another thing about having that geographic diversity and the domain experts nearby is that you do provide this opportunity for more people in the area to engage in that research, and then they can stay where they grew up. Maybe they want to do that and build up new businesses themselves. And so you're now building up the economy throughout the entire nation in this way. So I think there are a lot of benefits to having that geographic diversity and having those domain experts all working together.
Absolutely. We think a lot about that here at Scale. It's, for us, we have set up an AI center in St. Louis, Missouri. And what's interesting about St. Louis, it's a home of NGA, and there's lots of expertise there around sort of geospatial intelligence and kind of how you analyze and look at remote sensing data, and being able to kind of house our AI operation kind of side by side with these experts, I think allows for a lot sort of increased ability to sort of drive innovative solutions to some of these national security challenges. But one thing I wanted to kind of bring the conversation to is this question of how kind of both the U.S. and international governments are becoming more and more focused on trying to essentially regulate or generate policies around the future of AI. And most specifically, what we've seen both kind of in Europe and in the United States is this focus on responsible use of AI. And I think, there is very broad agreement among sort of most democratic nations or all democratic nations that AI needs to be used responsibly. And everyone kind of agrees with the key principle. But the real tougher question is how you sort of like operationalize this principle into something specific that actually can be turned into potential regulation. So I'm curious, as you sort of thought about this landscape and worked in it. I mean, you've traveled to Europe many times. You've spoken with people in Brussels who are focusing on these issues. Can you maybe talk a little bit about the kind of the evolution of AI policy globally and kind of where we are today? And then from there, maybe we can think about like what does the future hold for AI policy globally?
Yes. When you think about governance of AI, or what are those guardrails that we need for AI, people have different opinions, obviously. Some people are risk averse, and so they want to look at AI guidance and regulation in a way that makes sure that there's no possibility of the AI causing any harm. And others are more open to innovation and using AI for beneficial purposes and making sure that we have more of a risk-based approach of looking at each sector of use of AI and determining the extent to which there are risks associated with the use of AI in that sector, and then developing the appropriate guardrails. And I think that's the right approach. There's really no one size fits all for AI governance because each use case is different and the risks are different and the likelihood of those potential harms actually occurring are different. And so I think this presents a challenge for AI governance in that it's not easy just to say, here's one document and it's going to cover everything, because you can't possibly cover everything in one governance approach, I don't think. But what you can do is come up with processes and approaches for each use case of how you step through your thinking about it as you design, develop, procure, use AI in that domain, so that you're making sure you're asking the right questions and you're documenting appropriately what you're doing. And I think through that sort of approach, which is a sector-specific approach and a risk-based approach, we can come up with effectively it's a methodology for how to think about the responsible use of AI. I think it was pretty, in the whole scheme of things, it's pretty easy to say these are our principles that we agree to, but that implementation of principles is what I think needs that methodology. And so an example of this that was documented as an action for NIST to take in the National AI Initiative Act is the development of an AI risk management framework. And that, to me, is a methodology. It's a methodology for how to think about risk in particular use cases that allows you then to determine what the appropriate action should be so that you're determining the guardrails and the governance based on the specific use case as opposed to some catch-all that, kind of a one-size-fits-all. So I think there is I believe there's a growing agreement that that's the right approach to take. I think we're in the state, we sort of the world, I think in the approaches to responsible AI are still fleshing out what are those best practices? What are the questions we need to be asking ourselves? What is the documentation that we should be developing? When are the potential harms so high that we need to have something more of a regulatory approach or new regulations? Or what regulations already exist that cover particular use cases. So I think over the next 3 to 5 years around the world, we're going to be answering these questions and coming up with more concrete approaches. But I think, to me, I think that's the right way to go. And I do see the sort of the general consensus and trend in that direction. I think it's easy for all of us to get impatient and to think, well, why aren't we there now? Let's put a governance in place right now because, we haven't found the solution yet. But I do think I think there's good intentions all around to use AI responsibly. I don't think anybody sets out to build an AI system intentionally to harm someone. And so I think we just need to, in some sense, be patient as we work through what these best practices are and try to come together to have some consensus on these best practices and guardrails so that we can sort of collectively agree on how to approach these implementations of AI in a use kind of a sector specific approach.
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right. If you can imagine a world where, if the FDA is trying to approve an AI-powered medical diagnostic, and then you have the FAA working on sort of creating guidelines for drones flying in sort of congested airspace, the considerations for those two agencies are wildly different. And attempting to sort of create sort of one regulatory framework that's able to capture all the considerations that both the FAA and the FDA would have at the same time, I think is would be extraordinarily challenging. I guess I don't know if you have any specific views on kind of what's going on in Europe. I always find that a little bit fascinating to think about. The general sort of policy philosophy of Europeans tend to be more minimizing harms as sort of the priority as they embark on their regulatory endeavors. And if you think a little bit about the efforts that are underway in Brussels with their AI regulations, a lot of it is about trying to bucket what they consider sort of high risk AI applications. And those need to be more closely regulated versus sort of the low risk ones, which don't. I think in some ways, maybe the root of what they're trying to do is going to be similar to what's happening here in the US, where you can't really make an assessment of high risk or not unless you have some sort of managed process to assess it. So maybe they end up sort of coming around to the same place we do. But how do you kind of see that playing out?
Yeah, it's a challenge because I think, just as you point out, I think culturally, Europe is much more risk averse than the United States. I think unfairly, often we in the United States are portrayed as just, run fast, break things kind of mindset. We don't care if we run over people in the process. And I don't think that, I don't think that's fair. I think there is a spectrum though. And so when you look at the EU AI Act, I think broadly speaking, it has the right general structure in that they're trying to determine, what are those processes that you need to step through? Yes, what are the high risk cases, and so forth. The challenge is, your version of high risk might be different than my version of high risk. Or it might be that generally it's high risk, like none of us want to be on 24/7, 365 surveillance, for instance. We don't. But if there's a terrorist on the loose, then we definitely want law enforcement to have the ability to find them. Well, how do you accomplish both? And so do you say absolutely no surveillance, no cameras anywhere? And then we also throw out the case of protecting the Super Bowl game because we aren't allowing any law enforcement to have cameras there, for instance. I mean, so I think there's a whole spectrum here of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And I think sort of rolled into this is a challenge of trust. It's a trust not only in the technology, but in the people using the technology. And I think that's where the challenge, the breakdown typically happens. Because often, I'm a technologist. And so I might be able to prove that my facial recognition algorithm is perfect. But then you talk to someone that doesn't like the idea of facial recognition in some context, and you dig into it, and it's not often at the surface, the argument is about the technology. Oh, let's guard against the use of this technology because the technology may be biased. But when it boils down to it, it's really a concern not about the bias in the technology, but about the bias in the people or the lack of trust in the people and how they're using it. And so I think this is where the real complication comes into play. Right now, we seem to be focused in many cases on the technology itself as opposed to the uses of the technology. And then often when we talk about the uses of the technology, we're overly general and we don't think about the caveats of when those uses might be warranted under very restricted situations. For instance, if you think about trying to combat child trafficking, for instance. Well, you can use certain technological approaches to more quickly raise the likelihood that you're going to find the perpetrators of child trafficking, but that also means maybe that that there's some privacy concerns that come about in terms of where they get data to look at.
And I think you're totally right. One example that we sort of lived through, which immediately comes to mind, is there was legislation passed which directed the Department of Commerce to sort of analyze what export controls needed to be put in place for certain emerging technologies. One of the technologies was AI. Department of Commerce went on this sort of big endeavor to actually determine, are there any U.S. AI technologies that should be export controlled? And after a long comment period and a lot of analysis, they came out with one super niche, I think geospatial related use case, but essentially there was nothing in their opinion. And I think that shows that, questions of like the same facial recognitions that used to sort of unlock your cell phone in some ways can be used for lots of sort of very nefarious purposes. So drawing those lines is really, really hard. And even sort of experts in this space, as they try to kind of dig into it, oftentimes kind of run into some hurdles.
Yeah. Exactly. I agree. And so I think this keeps coming back to the use case. I think the danger is coming up with regulations that are too broad. And I think that's the risk of the EU AI Act, of it becoming too broad, rather than more of a fine-grained look at each use case, the willingness to accept exceptions, and so forth. So I think, the OMB memo that came out under the Trump administration, under our leadership, on the guidance for the regulation of AI in the private sector, I think has the right approach because, again, it's thinking about specific use cases under the domain of agencies that know all about those use cases, so they would have the expertise on what those caveats ought to be, so that we don't sort of throw out the AI baby with the
absolutely. DOT has been assuring the safety of vehicles for many decades, and they have dealt with all sorts of new technologies coming in for vehicles, and this is another one. To just pivot a little bit, in one area that I thought would be interesting for us to cover was the question of actually using AI in government. So we've talked a little bit about using AI out in industry and whether or not there's some role for government to play in sort of regulating that space. I think the other core question that I always think about is, the federal government is massive. It's huge, and it has a tremendous impact on so many Americans in so many different ways, from the way that you get your passport to the way that you sort of apply for a camping permit at a national park to everything in between. Americans interact with the government whether they want it to or not in so many different ways. filing taxes, whatever it may be. So how do you sort of think about, the use cases of AI in government? Where do you see there's opportunities where we can have the biggest impact? And I think from afar, and having been away for a little bit, the sort of follow-up question would obviously be is, what can we do to speed it up? Because I think a lot of people can say it's just not happening fast enough. But let's sort of maybe begin with, where do you see these use cases that could probably make the biggest impact for everyday Americans?
Yeah, there are so many use cases, and some of them are kinds of actions that may seem sort of mundane. The federal government has to process an enormous amount of paperwork, and if you can use AI to go through that paperwork and pick out the important information and summarize it in some way so that the people working at the agencies can focus on addressing your problem as a citizen rather than just going through mounds of paperwork. Certainly that's perfect for AI, just reviewing large data sets in general, streamlining processes, looking at ways to reform regulations so that they're not contradictory. One of the kind of use case illustrations that was given at the AI Government Summit back in 2020 was on regulatory reform and how you could use AI to dig through the regulations in order to find old regulations that are dealing with things like faxing, items in triplicate or whatever, or contradictory regulation where, one regulation says one thing, another says something else. And so you can use AI to detect those kinds of contradictions and then flag it for a person to correct. Their agencies are using AI to do things like modeling weather patterns, for instance, and looking at predictive maintenance on hardware that the mission agencies might be overseeing. So there are an enormous number of use cases. Interestingly, as part of that executive order on promoting the use of trustworthy AI in the federal government, the executive order dictated for agencies to talk about what their inventories are of AI use cases. And so I'm happy that, the final days as I was leaving, last I looked, there were about 13 agencies that have made public their use cases of AI. So, that's available on AI.gov, and people can see just the enormous number of those use cases. And I think there is more happening. I think the bottom line message is that there is more happening than people are aware of. But it's true. The agencies could be going more quickly, and part of this is a talent challenge. I don't think the federal agencies have enough people that know how to implement AI and how to go about identifying what the good use cases are. So that's why I think these collaborative efforts, such as the AI Center of Excellence or the AI Community of Practice, that brings agencies together to share ideas, best practices, and so forth, is a good way to help accelerate the adoption of AI across the federal government. But I think without the talent and without that information exchange, it's going to continue to be more slow than we would like.
Yeah. I think what I sort of often observed was, I think what's sort of unique about AI as a technology, you're essentially sort of attempting to procure a solution to a particular problem at an agency. And in order to sort of get buy-in and structure around that, it's a much different procurement process than, say, I need to find a new cloud vendor. Let me put out a solicitation and then I'll pick out which one is sort of, the cheapest or whatever it may be. So I think the buy-in that you need from other folks in the agencies to sort of drive these transformations, it doesn't reside singularly in the CIO of a particular agency. It extends to the actual political leadership and to other folks in the agencies who are actually responsible for the execution of the programs beyond just managing the tech stack. And I think finding the right combination of those two people working together to drive this transformation, I think is actually pretty hard to do.
It is hard. I think coming up with the procurement approach for AI systems is needed. I think it's recognized that it's needed. To some extent, it's hard to know where to start, but there are examples out there of how to approach AI procurement, and I think that's something that would help. You're talking about what you mentioned. What is it that causes government to be slower than they should be? And I think that's one area that causes federal agency members to be somewhat slow, is that they don't know how to go about procuring AI systems. They're afraid they're going to be held accountable for something that they weren't sure how they should have done better. There's not guidance, there's not best practices. So I think that will accelerate the use of AI in the federal government if we can come up with an approach to how to procure AI in a responsible manner.
And I think kind of the last thing, I think you mentioned it, and I kind of want to double click on it, is this question of bringing talent into government. And we've seen this sort of growth of these programs over the last, maybe 10 years about finding ways to bring people into government to do quote unquote tours of duty in the tech space. It started with the U.S. Digital Service. It's sort of this appendage of the White House. You have the Presidential Innovation Fellows, which were famously the very last bill that President Obama signed before President Trump's inauguration was kind of around that. So the question is, how do you sort of think about sort of bringing in talent? Have you seen this be successful, or what are kind of practices that agencies can think about in sort of bringing people on who maybe have the skills to kind of execute on these tough problems?
I think there are a number of mechanisms, and you mentioned a number of them that can enable people to have a tour of duty to work in the federal government for a while. And then return to maybe their industry job or their academic job. I think these programs have been very successful. The PIF program, the Presidential Innovation Fellows program that you mentioned, brings in a number of deep experts from industry that come to the federal government. They work for a year or two, and they make a real difference. And the agencies get a lot of benefit out of those kinds of programs. I don't know how well known these programs are. Myself, I was at, I worked the 6 years that I worked in the federal government under this Intergovernmental Personnel Act arrangement, where I'm on loan from my university, but I kept my affiliation with my university. And so there are a number of these kinds of mechanisms that make these kinds of temporary assignments to government possible. I'm not sure how well known they are, and I'm not sure the extent to which there's kind of this culture of, yes, let's serve for a couple of years in the federal government and provide that service. It's kind of a service mindset of let's give back, to the nation through federal service.
One thing I would add to that too, it's almost on both sides. It's both, being able to get the word out, to have sort of patriotic Americans who want to give back to their country and do service, to actually be aware of these programs and apply to them. But I think what's equally important, and maybe even tougher, is making sure that once these people are actually placed at these agencies, senior leadership at these agencies recognize the value that these experts could have, bring them into the right conversations, and give them sort of the ability to actually make the impact that's possible. Because you could have the smartest person in the world, but if they're airdropped in an agency without sort of political top cover, it's like good luck in getting something done.
Totally agree. I do think that there is an increasing awareness at top level leadership of the value of these folks visiting, working for a while in the federal government. So I think, success breeds success. And I do think that many of these programs have been effective. And so I'm hopeful that over time, maybe they will grow and accelerate and more people will become aware of it and take advantage of it.
Absolutely. Well, Lynne, thank you so much. It's been tremendous to kind of catch up. Thank you for joining us, and best of luck with everything in Tennessee.
Thanks, Michael. Great talking with you. Best of luck to you as well.
Thank you.